Certainly this is the case. The moment the colonies decided to break the tie with the empire, they recognized that they can't do it alone. Those are, after all, 13 rather weak entities fighting against the mightiest empire. And the only way they could do it is through foreign intervention. So from the outset, the foreign intervention was what the colonies needed and sought. And naturally, they turned to England's primary enemy, or primary rival, sorry, France. So the question was, how can you get France to actually intervene? Initially, France did not want to bet on the American colonies because the likelihood that this rebellion will succeed was not high. There are historical debates whether the French decided to intervene following the victory at Saratoga, as the traditional interpretation is, or as other historians claim that it has to do with the preparedness of the French Navy that was not ready until 1778 to take on this kind of commitment. Nevertheless, the key was getting France involved, and France began its involvement early on. I mean, it gave immediately a loan to the rebels, and there were all sorts of negotiations prior to the actual signing of the Franco-American Treaty of 1778. Well, Franklin was already a very experienced diplomat. Let's not forget that Franklin spent much of the previous decade in England representing the colonies to the Parliament. So in that capacity, he gained a great deal of experience. He was by far the most known American. In fact, he was probably the only well-known American of that era. His work on electricity in particular gained him fame. And his reputation was so great that when Franklin, for example, visited the opera in France, Voltaire was there too. And there was all these calls for these two great men of the Enlightenment to get together, and as the story is told, and I'm not sure if it's true or not, but that's the way at least it's told. Voltaire and Franklin, the two giants of the Enlightenment, meet and they hug to the cheers of the crowd. I mean, Franklin was so big internationally, and in some ways he is. People know about Franklin today, but they know particularly about his kite, about his womanizing. To be sure, all of those things were good, but he was really an intellectual giant, and the King of France was so annoyed with Franklin's fame that he, kind of in a kind of act of, I don't know, childish aggression, distributed plates with Franklin's portrait on it rather than his own. It used to be a custom to, the king would give plates with his own portrait, but one with Franklin's portrait sort of was kind of protesting the great reputation and fame of Benjamin Franklin. I mean, Franklin is certainly a very unusual diplomat. We have never had a diplomat of such standing. I don't think that anybody ever had someone like that. Part of the story with Franklin's time in Paris is how crucial was his reputation to the formation of the Franco-American alliance. There's a danger of putting too much emphasis on Franklin himself, because it's quite possible actually quite likely, that the French would have gotten involved in the American Revolution regardless of Franklin. But Franklin himself, because he moved in the Parisian circles, because he was so popular in Parisian salons, certainly turned the American cause into a cool thing. And so one of the features of the Parisian mission of Franklin is that his popularity not only got him got the French king his popularity not only annoyed the French king, but it also drove John Adams crazy. John Adams came to France. He was sent to join Franklin with the idea that together they will sort of negotiate the relationship. It was already after the agreement was signed. And Adams arrives with his wife. They're coming from Braintree, Massachusetts, from a Puritan colony, and they are horrified by what they see, of Franklin, particularly his behavior with French women. And Abigail Adams writes a letter to a friend in which she kind of describes with great disgust how Franklin comes and this, woman who is all made up, kisses him in public. And, for the anal Adamses who are as sour as they come to encounter this bon vivant Franklin in Paris and to see this particular kind of behavior was quite unnerving. And Adams, in particular, was annoyed that Franklin got all the credit in France. Adams felt that he himself was of far greater importance than Franklin, which suggests something about Adams, who's heard of John Adams? He was some lawyer from Massachusetts. And Adams believed that he was the real author behind the Declaration of Independence, that his model treaty, he authored in 1776 a model treaty as how the United States should negotiate with Europe, with other powers. And as the author of the model treaty, which was the most important document that ever come out of the Continental Congress, he deserve all the credit. He believed that Franklin was actually trying to deny him money. There were conflicts over money because Franklin controlled the purse and that Adams did not get the money, he felt, and Adams was then decided to leave and he went to depart, but the British Navy was controlling the seas, so it wasn't safe for him, so he believed that Franklin actually was trying to not allow him to get, was in cahoots with the British Navy, not to allow him to leave, not to tell Congress in America what Franklin was actually doing. And he had a couple of nervous breakdowns over Franklin. But the diplomats were, yes, it's to be sure, yes. I mean, the diplomats were during the American Revolution. There were dangers of traveling by sea, and there are, and so the question is, how are you going to get through, and which boat you're going to take. Also, the notion, it wasn't a blockade the way we envisioned a blockade. The technology was not there to provide such hermetic blockades. But the Royal Navy was capable of blocking particular ports. It wasn't really interested in American diplomats so much. It was more interested in the West Indies and in blocking the West Indies from supplying, from actually exchanging goods with the rebelling colonies, because the West Indies was the most important market. The West Indies much of American diplomatic history actually centers on the West Indies, even though Europe is there. It's really the key for the United States is the West Indies. Well, his relationship with Vergennes, who was the foreign minister of the king, who was in charge of French diplomacy, and the key here is Franklin tried to entice France to join forces with the colonies. Did the French have an interest in helping the American colonies? This is actually something that is a major question in French historiography, because as you may recall, the event that triggers the French Revolution was the financial difficulties of the monarchy. And helping the Americans certainly worsened in a very significant way the financial stability of the monarchy. And so why should France help? Is it just to get even with England over the defeat in in what's in America called the French and Indian War and what's in Europe called the 7-Year War. Is there more involved here? Is there a the French want to repossess certain colonies? It doesn't seem to be the case. What exactly is the French interest here? To weaken England in a broader European balance of power? It certainly did not pay for the French to help the Americans in the American Revolution. Well, for one, there was financial, from the beginning there was a financial assistance. They established a company, a fictitious company that dealt with the Americans because they didn't want to annoy the British initially. And then, they sent troops, and they sent the troops, and the French Navy participated. And later on, when Spain and then Holland joined, England is in trouble. Not so much. The English concern is not so much again about the continental colonies, but England wants to save its most important possessions, and those are in the West Indies. The wealth comes from the West Indies. That's where the slave colonies are producing sugar and tobacco and coffee and a variety of other, but primarily sugar, that is really generating incredible wealth. Present-day Haiti, the poorest country in the region, was the most prosperous European colony in the New World, generating much more wealth than all the continental United States combined. So the focus, once it becomes sort of a global war, and once the British in 1781, after the defeat in Yorktown, are kind of have to decide whether they want to engage again in the continent, they shift, the theater moves to the West Indies. Indispensable. The United States would not have existed without the French support. There is no way that these colonies, these rebels, would have survived the onslaught of the British Army. There's no way that, remember that there were, it's hard to estimate, but we guessed around 20% of the population were loyalists. We're not sure exactly. There were more patriots and loyalists, to be sure, but not in an overwhelming fashion. And without the French involvement, there would have been no United States of America. There's just not. This is one of those things that Americans need to remember. Diplomacy is very important here. Because the crucial challenge of the new nation is expressed in the word legitimacy. What gives a new government legitimacy? Remember, there were British troops in American continent. It's in Northwest Territory. The territory is supposed to be the United States. There were secessionist movements all over from in the West. Even the little island of Nantucket wanted to secede. There were profound cultural differences between the different states, different societies, and the assumption was that the coalition that made the United States would not survive. In fact, during the 1780s, the idea of Jefferson's idea was that through agreements with other countries, the American collective will be created. In other words, because there's nothing that united South Carolina and Massachusetts. South Carolina was mostly a Caribbean type colony, and Massachusetts was a Puritan, kind of harsh place, and so what unites them? What the idea was, through relationship with the outside world, we're going to create something called the American nation. And that's why diplomacy is so important here. It's not because the diplomats themselves are going to strike deals, but the only thing that unites and creates this nation is the view from outside. And so the diplomats are, by having these agreements, you ratify this, and this nation exists. you had to prove it also to the people themselves, because the federal government was so incompetent and so unable to provide any services to anything. I mean, there were rebellions, and there were vigilante militias, and a variety of other things that challenged sovereignty. So agreements with the other powers was crucial. And the problem was that no nation sent representative or minister to the United States. Why? Because nobody thought that this was a nation yet. The Louisiana Purchase is one of those mythological stories that seem to be actually founded in truth. According to that story, Livingston and Monroe are in Paris. They're there to negotiate the kind of some lease to the port of New Orleans, which is central to the American West because of the trade, the movement of agricultural goods down the Mississippi River, and according to the kind of the I don't know, to mythology, Napoleon walks in and says to the Americans, "Why don't you just take it all?" So there was not a great feat of diplomacy according to this story, and they ask, "How big is it?" And he says, "Why don't you go and find out?" Or why don't you find out yourself, or something like that, of that nature. But of course, the Louisiana Purchase, and it was the greatest real estate deal in the history of humanity, even better than the purchase of Manhattan. But the key to it, again, is the West Indies. It is the fact that the key to Napoleon's imperial vision after the Peace of Amiens was to recreate a French empire that is global, that could compete with the British Empire. And the most important place was Saint-Domingue, present-day Haiti, which he tried to reconquer following the rebellion led by Toussaint Louverture. Ironically, Jefferson and the Americans tried to help him reconquer Saint-Domingue. Whereas the Federalists had a policy of support for the French, for the black rebels of Saint-Domingue, for the rebel slaves. The Jeffersonians, of course, were a party of the South and very much wedded to slavery. And so Jefferson actually promises some assistance to the French, and Napoleon launches the expedition to reconquer the West Indies. Once that expedition fails, and fails miserably, Louisiana has no value whatsoever to the French. They don't have Canada. They already gave Canada in 1763. They don't have the Saint-Domingue. They have nothing. Louisiana is just a piece of land they can't even get access to. And that's why he decided to dump it. So it's one of those realities that Americans rarely know, that the United States owes its most successful diplomatic coup to the rebel slaves of Saint-Domingue. He was not. Nobody had any idea. In fact, when it's just like what you say no, you take it. In fact, there was a debate in the Senate whether you can accept Louisiana or not, and according to the Constitution, you couldn't. And the Federalists at that time, who were obstructionists, as obstructionists can get, tried to block it, saying that it was not authorized. And indeed, it certainly doesn't gel with Jefferson's strict constructionism, supposedly. I mean, there was no constitutional authority to do it, but it was so obviously a great deal for the United States, so obviously something that you should grab, that the administration did that. The fact that diplomatic missions were political appointments. The idea that only giants were nominated was really not true. In fact, perhaps we should also cover an important fiasco in American diplomacy in the 1790s. And that's a very important one. And it has to do with the behavior of James Monroe, future President of the United States. Monroe was a hero of the American Revolution and a highly regarded member of the Virginia aristocracy. And he was sent to France to be the American representative to replace Gouverneur Morris. And Monroe hears about the Jay Treaty, the treaty that was signed between United States and Britain, that's actually created the first rapprochement between England and Great Britain and the United States. And as you know, in the United States, well, maybe I should say as you know, in the United States, the Jay Treaty generated great animosity from the Republicans because it was during the wars of the French Revolution, and the United States was clearly siding with England. The Jay Treaty did not allow the Jeffersonians to engage in what they really wanted to do, which was kind of to try to play both countries and get the best, get the best deal for the United States. The Jeffersonians were pro-French, and so there was great opposition to the treaty in the United States. And Jefferson and Madison write letters to Monroe. Now, Jefferson is no longer Secretary of State. Madison is just a congressman. And they write letters to Monroe, and they tell him about the opposition. And they tell him about the position of the Republican elements to the Jay Treaty. Monroe, in turn, goes and kind of appeals to the French to respond very harshly to the United States, to reject the American acceptance of the signing of the Jay Treaty. What follows afterwards are French assaults on American shipping and a variety of other French sanctions. And it was a real embarrassment for Monroe. Sorry,
Oh, no, go ahead, sorry.
I see signs. It was a real embarrassment for Monroe because there you have an American diplomat pleading with the host country to take anti-American measures. And he's recalled in great shame by the Washington administration. Again, because the boundaries of what is proper diplomatic behavior, what is actually a nation is not clear yet. I mean, is Monroe representative of the United States, or is he representative of the Republican interest? And the Republican interest could be something that is international. There is this element here that we take for granted the existence of a coherent nation state or a coherent territory that is represented by a diplomat. But if you think of different kind of association, particularly at that time, and if you think of the alliances struck by Republican groups all over Europe and the United States, who did Monroe owe his allegiance to? There was a kind of an attitude that was first tried after the conclusion of the revolution, in which American diplomacy was supposed to be different. A European Commission was formed, composed of Franklin, Adams, and Jefferson, and they were supposedly sent. They were all three of them went to Europe. I mean, Franklin and Adams were already there. Jefferson joined them. They were supposed to sit in Paris and offer kind of a fair deal to everybody. The idea was, open no tariff, sort of free trade agreements with everybody, and sort of no special deals, no acknowledgement of this interest and that interest. The problem was that this proved to be completely unrealistic. No European power actually wanted to deal with this group, and why? Because the United States already offered what it's going to give: open harbors. I mean, the American ports were open, so there was no reason for a European country to pay anything. The only countries that signed some free trade agreements with those commissions was Morocco, not as significant. It was a little kingdom that was known mostly for piracy, and Prussia, which at that time did not even have access to sea. So this idea that American diplomacy can be different, that you're not going to be able to strike deals, that it's this kind of better than European, collapsed immediately. The American diplomats had to follow protocol, had to protect American interests the way European diplomats did here in the United States. I mean, the same problem was for Jefferson's experience with Anthony Merry, the British minister who was sent to the United States to be the English representative. And the first Jefferson tried to kind of deal with him in a way that was Republican, and he accepted him in the White House wearing slippers. And no diplomatic protocol was observed. And it's true that during the Jefferson administration there was this attitude, but by the time the Madisons are in power, are occupying the White House, sorry, this is no longer the case. You no longer try to democratize the European diplomatic corps. When Monroe and Livingston are in Paris and they get this incredible offer, what can they do? They have no way to contact Jefferson and Madison, who were then the Secretary of State, and say to him, hey, we got this great deal, what do you say? They had to act on the spot. In general, diplomats had general instructions. That's the big difference between older diplomacy and contemporary diplomacy, where contemporary diplomats they're constantly in contact with the State Department, with the executive branch. They did not. They had general instructions, and sometimes they made mistakes. In 1807, Monroe and Pinckney signed an agreement with England to settle sort of the problems between the two countries, the ones that led to the War of 1812. And this agreement is rejected by Madison and Jefferson, not even submitted for consideration by Congress, because they deviated from the instructions the way Madison and Jefferson understood them, whereas Monroe and Pinckney believed that they did not. I mean, so you would send somebody, and you would have to count on their good judgment.